Hi, I just wanted to show you how you might use cubing specifically for a literary analysis. So the purpose of these concepts for generating ideas in text is to help you get these ideas out before you actually sit down to start typing a rough draft. I think what happens a lot of times is that students will sort of just skip over this brainstorming or generating ideas process and go right to the creation of a rough draft. And what happens is that if they haven't sat down and thought about all the stuff they want to include, writing that draft ends up taking a lot longer than they think. And they also tend to run out of ideas, and the essay ends up running a bit short, which is not what you want. I think most of you and most students in general, probably the two most important things that you think about when working on an assignment is how can I not take a million years to do this, and how can I get a good grade on this? And this process of generating ideas before the drafting process, I think is going to save you some time and give you lots of stuff to write about. And the idea is to come up with even more ideas than you'll actually use. So you can kind of pick and choose those better things to write about as opposed to struggling every paragraph trying to figure out what can be included. So I wanted to focus on this specific tactic for generating ideas, which is called cubing. And I know that the description above, sounds like it might not be that relevant for a literary analysis. Like, you're not going to talk about the color or size of something in a literary analysis. But I do think that it can be useful. You just have to sort of apply it to this specific genre of essay. So, again, the idea behind cubing is looking at something in a bunch of different ways. What I notice happens a lot is that students get so locked into looking at anything, a topic, a text, whatever, and they look at it in just one way. And what ends up happening is they inevitably run out of stuff to say about it because they're only sort of looking at it with that one track mind. So I think something that you can always do is if you get stuck, even when you've started writing the draft, is think about, is there a different way or different perspective that I can look at this from? Because just kind of changing perspective might give you a lot more ideas. And remember, like in this generating phase, not all of this is going to be useful. Not all ideas are good, but some of them might be helpful. So, like I said, I think it's good to generate more ideas than you'll actually use. This is kind of your visual process of thinking through something. So, again, at the top here, I have these sort of 6 basic ways that you might look at something, anything really. And again, there are probably other perspectives that you could look at something from, but these are sort of like 6 common ways that you might look at it. You can describe something, you can compare it to something else, you can classify it, you can analyze it, you can apply it, and you can argue for or against it. So I wanted to show you specifically how you might do this when you're looking at a text. So I chose a movie/book that probably a lot of you are familiar with. If you're not, that's okay. I think you'll still get the point. But what I should also say is you should not choose The Wizard of Oz as your text that you're going to analyze for this essay. Not just because I'm doing all the work for you, but also because it's just too long. It's both a film and a novel, both of which are probably too long to analyze in a 5-page paper. You want something shorter, like a poem or a short story. So let's think about how we might take this story and apply some of these different perspectives to help think through this text. So as far as description, again, I'm not going to talk about color or size or these things that I would talk about describing a physical object, but I can describe what happens in the film. So realistically, this sort of perspective might help me think about summary, like what I want to actually tell the audience about this text before I start analyzing it. But also, it might help me think about these general observations about the text. Because, like we talked about previously, these observations can lead you to evidence that you can use in your analysis, right? So, as far as description, again, most of you guys probably know the story. It's about this young girl named Dorothy who runs away to save her dog from being euthanized. I think a lot of people forget that fact, but Toto bites this mean lady, Elmira Gulch, who then threatens to have him euthanized. And again, in the film, we see that this lady ends up becoming the Wicked Witch. That's how Dorothy kind of imagines her, right? But that's why she initially runs away, because Toto's going to get euthanized. Dorothy gets picked up by a tornado and transported to a magical land, which is shown by the film switching from black and white to color. Dorothy meets 3 friends as she travels down a yellow brick road and learns from a wizard, in quotes, because he's a fraud, right, that she can only return home after completing this mission of killing a wicked witch. And again, those are just a few things from the story. But, these are things that somebody who has not read the book or seen the movie would probably need to know in order to understand how you're analyzing it, right? You might include a couple of other things, but this is like general description. So, not all this might make it into my analysis, but these are probably important observations that I'll at least talk about a little bit, whether that's in the summary section or later when I'm analyzing in the essay. So I might think about comparison. So I said here, The Wizard of Oz reminds me a lot of Alice in Wonderland. And I think that the author of Wizard of Oz actually came out and said he was influenced by that story as well. So both stories feature this young girl as the main character. So Dorothy and Alice, I think, are kind of similar. They both involve a journey to a magical land and encounters with interesting creatures, both good and evil. You see that in both of these stories. Both girls have to ultimately stand up to an evil female character near the end, and once they do, they wake up from a dream to find themselves home again. So, especially the endings of these stories are similar. So again, I might not talk about Alice in Wonderland at all in my analysis essay, but maybe some of this stuff is important. This idea of like this journey theme and good and evil, and this idea of like waking up from a dream and being home again. Those might be things that I think about or talk about why they're happening in this text. So that's it. I mean, probably in your analysis you're going to focus on only one text, but just by comparing it to something else might get you thinking about like what's really going on in this story. Number 3 here, I might classify it, right? So talk about what type it is or what genre it fits into. So it seems to be in this sort of fantasy genre, or maybe more specifically like a fantasy journey story. And it seems to be specifically like a children's fantasy, right? I mean, you could argue that adults are interested in this too, but it seems to be geared toward children, to me anyway. And it kind of reminds me of some of these other stories that we might say would fit in that genre, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or maybe even The Lord of the Rings. Again, Lord of the Rings is maybe like a little bit more like young adult or adult, but yeah, they all kind of follow this same structure. So, I might talk about what is contained in this genre, right? So these stories seem to emphasize how the physical journey to complete some mission is connected to the journey of growing up and learning how to be powerful in the adult world. So all these stories, and I would include Alice in Wonderland in here too. They're all about this idea of like, how can a kid or somebody who's small or less powerful become powerful when all these sort of forces are trying to stop them, right? So again, if I were talking about this in a paper, I probably would not talk about like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe or Lord of the Rings. That would probably get me too off topic from my text. But again, I might talk about like why this journey theme is important, or this idea of growing up and how it plays into the story. So again, a lot of this is like leading you to things that you could focus on in your text. Obviously, analyzing is going to be really important for this essay. And there are lots of different parts that you could sort of zoom in on and talk about. I don't know, maybe there's a way to connect all of these different parts and talk about how they're, all leading to some overall meaning. Or you might just focus on one of these things and write the whole paper on one of these aspects. But again, analyzing is about breaking something down into its parts and talking about how they're connected. So, one point of analysis might be just this character of Dorothy. She begins by trying to run away from her problems at home, and by the end of the journey, she faces her fears head on and knows she has the power to change things on her own. Something that I always notice, especially about the film, is why color seems really important or significant. You have the yellow brick road, the Emerald City, ruby slippers. There's that horse that changes colors. And you might think about like, why is color important? And, what might these different colors signify? I'm not sure, but it seems important. You might focus on a particular theme, like the theme of home. So Dorothy initially runs away from home, but spends the whole rest of the story desperately trying to return home, only to find that she could be home whenever she wanted, with the click of her heels. So it might raise a question like, is home a feeling that you have rather than a physical place? Maybe, right? So these are all things that you could analyze when you're talking about your text. Number 5 is application or applying it. So you might think about like, why does this story matter? Like, what's the point? In some ways, it could be just like a silly children's story. But I think most stories and poems have a point, right? Why does this matter in real life? So to me, it seems to send the message that a person should appreciate the people who love and support them, because that's what home is, the feeling of security and comfort. In real life, people often take things for granted and focus on what they don't have. And I always think about how social media kind of makes us have this grass is greener mentality. If more people adopted this message of gratitude, maybe they'd be a lot happier. I don't know, maybe that's like a real message that this author's trying to get across, right? So again, think about like, why does this story matter, or how does it address a real life problem? And then finally, remember that when you're doing an analysis, you're also kind of making an argument, right? You're arguing that a certain interpretation makes sense, or that you have reasons or evidence to support that interpretation. So again, I'm just talking about like one interpretation here. I think there are lots of ways you can interpret it, but one interpretation of the story seems to be that it's about the journey from childhood to adulthood, and how that transition involves confronting obstacles on one's own. So again, I might start listing evidence that supports that, right? So I notice in the story that Toto initiates several instances in which Dorothy has to stand up for herself and face fears. Like, he seems like a pretty bad little dog, but every time he runs away, he's like leading Dorothy into some new obstacle that she has to face, right? And forcing her to be brave. So that seems significant. And what I also notice is that the 3 friends embody insecurities that people often have to overcome. So the Scarecrow, that he's not smart enough. The Tin Man, that he's not good enough. He doesn't have a good enough heart. And the Lion, that he's too scared, right? I don't know. It seems like these are all things that Dorothy is kind of